Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now what I've got whizzing around in front of me today is one of these Scavengers from the Stargrave plastics line. And they're an interesting case because Stargrave itself doesn't have a massively strong visual language of its own. Normally I've seen people playing Stargrave with Star Wars miniatures or even things from the Alien board game, but Stargrave's plastics are actually pretty good. They're a little bit generic, but I say that as a net positive. They're a lot of fun to paint up. And once you've got an idea of what you want to do with them, so maybe push the color scheme a little bit and give them a slightly grimier finish, yeah, they can be a lot of fun. They look really good once they're done. So today's is pretty simple. All of the paints will be listed in the description below, and I'm going to do one or two things differently than I normally would. Always fun. So let's get started. This fella, once I assembled him, badly, was primed. I've used here Raven Black. Now, it does not matter which black you use. I literally picked this one up because it was on the top of my collection of primers. Matte Black or Chaos Black, it'll all be fine. Now, what I'm mixing up on my little palette over here is roughly half and half water and oak brown from the Army Painter. It could also be Rhinox Hide or German Camo Black Brown. They aren't the same color, but something dark brown with a little bit of warmth is going to be perfect here. What I'm going to do is splatter this over the entire miniature. And the idea here is that we're introducing a little bit of warmth to our base, as it were. And as this dries, it's also going to make it a little bit easier to see what we're doing, which is another nice sort of side effect to it. So, straight over everything, and let's try and hold him in shot here. It's going to look dreadful going on, but don't worry, particularly don't worry if it doesn't cover properly, because it's not really what we're looking for. Now that is quite brown. There's probably a little less water than I should have added, but it doesn't matter too much, because we are going to go over most of this anyhow. What this is for, like I said, is just to give us a little bit of warmth, and I can see what I'm doing a bit more clearly now. Now, we are going to carry on using that brown in a little bit, and I'll get to that when we come to it. But for now, we'll start by base coating his skin. And for this, I have Ruddy Umber. Now, this is from the Army Painter. This is basically what tanned flesh used to be. And I've got just a tiny wee bit of water in there as well. So, away we go. This is definitely going to need a second coat over top once this first one has dried. Try and be relatively tidy with it, but don't worry if you do hit anywhere that you want to be a different color later. Alright, so 2 coats later, I've got a nice, easy skin tone. What I'm going to do now is start by painting the lowest level and up. So it's going to be sort of the undershirt thing that he's wearing here. Now I've decided what I'm going to use for that is green-brown. Now that is a VALLEJO color, and I've got a little bit of it here on my palette. Let's just zoom on that. And next to it is some oak brown. Now this little dollop is going to serve me well through a few bits. What I'm going to do is get just a tiny wee bit of this on my brush and then mix it in near the edge of my next color up. Then a little bit at a time, I'm just going to mix some of that into my green-brown until I get a sludgy brown-green-brown mix. What I'll do then is to use this to base coat, first of all, the area that I want to be that slightly lighter color, and I'll leave just a little bit of the brown stuff right in the corners if I can. I'm not too worried if I do hit, some of the corners with this, because we're going to wash this guy later. But this is quite handy as a way to get what is quite a bright color over top of a much darker one, without having to go through 3 or 4 interstitial stages or 3 or 4 different other paint pots. So mixing in your brown gives you your base color, and then once that's dried, we can then go back to our little puddle of normal green-brown, and this time just leave a little bit of our sort of browner, darker stuff in the recesses. So now you might see a little variation in color there, which is quite nice. Some of you are probably thinking, hey, that's how we used to paint all the time. Yeah, it was. I remember those days too. So in that vein, what I'm going to do now is get a tiny bit of ancient stone. This is basically an ivory sort of color. Anything light, just off-white will work quite well for this. And I'm going to mix that again into my base coat. So a little bit of this into the green-brown until I'm satisfied with my highlight color. Then let's go ahead, add a little bit of this at first. Now it's going to look, as it goes on, lighter than it will when it dries. So bear that in mind. Just pop a wee touch of it on, let it dry, and then see if you want to add more ivory, or ancient stone rather, or whatever lighter color you're using. But like that, I've now got a sort of 3-step highlight. And those two colors, the oak brown and the ancient stone, are all I need to do that for pretty much every color I've got. So don't feel as though you need always to be buying 2,000 paints. So let's do the same on his jacket. Again, tiny wee blip of oak brown, and I'm going to pop that into some woodland camo. This is a nice sort of generic army man green. And once I'm satisfied with that, this one's going to be a little bit easier to apply. Just straight over the top of the coat. Oh, that's nice. And then we go to our neat woodland camo. And same as before, we want to leave just a little bit of that muted brown stuff in the recesses. So this can be a slightly more time-consuming way of painting, but it's a bit of fun sometimes. And it's good to practice for your brush control as well. So let's pop a little bit of this. This is nice and simple. Now that can be quite a useful way to add a bit of shape to a miniature, which, with all the love in the world to these scavengers, they tend not to have a huge amount of surface detail. So now I'm going to mix in a little bit of the ivory, or the ancient stone rather, from before, and we'll do the same thing. Just pick a couple of areas where I want a slightly more faded finish. And there isn't really a right answer to how much here. Starting from roughly half and half is probably a pretty good metric to test it out. But you can experiment, particularly with some darker colors. They'll benefit from slightly less ivory at first. But let's go ahead and add just a little more shape to this guy with our ivory and woodland camo mix. Then you may find that you've got plenty of shape, but you still want a slightly sharper edge highlight in some areas, just to sell those corners and what have you. So mix in a little more ivory. So now we've got loads of definition there on the coat, and I'm quite happy with that. You can do that with each color. I tend to look at the sort of 3-stage as being the easiest, you know, a little bit of brown, a little bit of your color, and then mix in some of the ivory. But this, yeah, you can take it as far as you like. If you do discover, as you're doing this, that you've gone a little too far, you know, maybe you've mixed in too much ivory and you don't like how it looks, what you could do, and it's just a thought, would be to grab like military shader or Athonian camo shade or something and pop that over the top. Now, for his equipment, I'm actually going to go back to neat oak brown and fill in most of the flat areas with this. I'm going to leave a little bit of that, I want to say shaded, it's not shaded, but the grimy black stuff in the recesses will be our shading step here for the most. And then along comes oak brown with a tiny bit of ivory mixed in. And again, I keep calling it ivory, but really it should be ancient stone. But all the same, you can use an ivory paint, doesn't matter. Don't get too hung up on the exact colors that I'm using. And just while I'm doing that, thank goodness I did, because I forgot I hadn't base coated this funky little bedroll he's carrying, and I'm just using some dusty skull for this. And then I'll use a little bit of neat ancient stone, because if I mix that in, it's not going to make much difference. They're quite close to one another. So just straight from the pot for this. A couple of lines to give this some definition. Now a couple of base coats, just as a style choice, I'm not going to mess around with mixing in those base coats. I have here Angel Green, and I'm going to use this for, there's a couple of armor patches he's got, and this vambrace thing. So here on his jacket, and his knee pads as well, I'm going to use this neat. Now for his beanie, I have some Bootstrap brown, and I'm going to leave the hair at the back here in the just black and shaded brown that we did earlier. You could paint his hair, of course, any colour you fancy, but I fancy saving the step. And then for his boots, I'm just going to pop some matte black over the top of those. Now his weapon, I'm actually going to leave the faded, grimy brown that it is already. And that is because I've got an idea. And I know I say all the time, don't let me experiment on camera, but hey ho, I'm going to do it. Now once all of those base coats are applied, I did mention that you could go without washing the fella, but there is something specific I want to do here. Now the game color wash is quite different from most of the other washes and shades that I've used in the past, because you're going to see here, ordinarily if I go over a black with something like, I don't know, Agrax Earthshade or Strong Tone, they tend to disappear. They're quite translucent, they let the black shine through. Whereas the Umber wash here from VALLEJO settles a little bit more like a paint. And what we'll see instead is that where it collects over black and other dark colors, we get a little bit of the brown that's actually in here settle there. So it looks grubby and grimy. That's perfect for what I've got in mind. So make sure that you give it a really thorough shake to get everything all mixed in together. And then I'm going to apply this over the entire miniature. So same as I would with any other wash, once I've popped it on, just give it a couple of seconds to settle and then shift any big clumps around. But this is relatively simple. We're just going to jam it over everything. In particular, I'm going to pay attention and make sure that it is on the weapon here, because this is a pretty big part of what I had in mind for this grimy gun. I really hope this works. And one of the other things that's really handy about that particular wash line is that it dries super matte. Now I didn't do quite what I had in mind on the rifle, so what I am going to do instead is I've mixed up here, this is 3 parts of Warpaints Stabilizer with 1 part of the Fresh Rust from the Army Painter. It doesn't need to be Warpaints Stabilizer, I've used that mostly because it's easier to dole out exact measurements. I'm going to go over the weapon with it. That's more what I had in mind. Now this is quite thin, but it is going to look pretty vile going on. Just give it a second as it settles, and same as with a wash, you can shift it around anywhere that it collects a bit too much. Now that's what I had in mind. I really want this to look like he's gone magnet fishing for this gun. Now what I'm going to turn to, this is one of my little cheap brushes, a little size 2 one, and it's gotten old, so it's perfect for dry brushing. I've got a little tiny bit of gunmetal on it, and I'm going to very, very lightly catch just some of the edges of this rusted old gun. I don't want to do too much of this, because if I do, it's going to look way more shiny than I'd like. But just to catch the edges and make it look like he's kind of hurriedly buffed it enough to make it work. Once that same brush has dried, I'm going to come back with some Command Khaki, very light dry brush over the beanie here. And then to finish him off, what I'm going to do is highlight his face and hands. So I'm going to start with Barbarian Flesh, and I'm going to paint in most of his skin with this, but leave just a little bit of our shaded stuff in the recesses. So between his fingers as much as I can, we'll leave around the sides of his nose, bottom lip, that sort of thing. We'll leave that nice and dark. And then a tiny wee bit of Dorado Skin. I'm going to use that to dot on the tip of his nose, cheekbones, probably a little bit of his chin, and we'll do the back of his knuckles as well. Now from here what I'm going to do is to go ahead and varnish him, and then I will pop his base on him, and the recipe for that will be in the description. And so, there at last, our scavenger is complete. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with that result. The fact that I had to come back and repaint him, I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, didn't really hurt all that much in the end. And I'm quite happy with that. The orange, particularly with the rusty gun, I think adds a fair bit to the miniature itself, because having deliberately kept the colour scheme so simple, a wee splash of something warm in the base and the weapon, I think really adds a fair bit to it. So yeah, when I went outside the first time to varnish this fella, I hit him with a black primer instead. And I actually have, let's just chuck this dude down. Sad times. Yeah, folks did mention wanting to see how I might come back from that, but honestly, if I'm trying to show you how to bake a souffle and the souffle collapses, well, I gotta start over. And I'm glad I did. I did enjoy painting this fella. So, as always, thanks goes out to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, which includes my most gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Thank you very much for your support, folks. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Blue Sky and Instagram, they're both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.